Oh, hi there. How many masterpieces can one filmmaker make in a lifetime? Over a 48-year career, Kubrick released 13 feature films, many of which are among the most analyzed and studied in film history. Kubrick's process was obsessive, exacting, and demanding, resulting in films that were so deeply personal to the director that to prevent his movies from being edited against his will, burnt all unused footage for the majority of his films, resulting in some of the most sought-after lost media in all of cinema. In addition to deleted scenes, Kubrick spent years on projects that would never materialize, some that never made it past the concept phase, while others were written, researched, cast, and nearly made it to filming, only for it to fall apart at the 11th hour. In this video, I'll be covering everything from Kubrick's proposed film adaptations, his unproduced scripts, deleted scenes, and everything that against all odds has been preserved. I'll end the video by covering the infamous conspiracy theory concerning Kubrick's final film and the secret society that some believe he exposed. So without further ado, here is the unreleased, cancelled, and lost media of Stanley Kubrick. The early documentaries. As a young man, Kubrick made a living as a photographer, selling his work to Look magazine, eventually becoming a full-time staff photographer. He photographed boxing matches that would inspire him to make his directorial debut with the short documentary, Day of the Fight, in 1951, that has some classic Kubrick hallmarks. Like 3/4 of the short is just mundane preparation. We don't even see a boxing ring until the last few minutes. He was able to sell Day of the Fight for $4,000 against a $3,900 budget. This modest profit of $100 from Day of the Fight was enough to convince Kubrick to quit his day job at age 23 and pursue filmmaking full-time. His next project was another short documentary, Flying Padre, about a Catholic priest in New Mexico, released in 1952. And until the late 70s, these were the only two documentaries we knew Kubrick filmed. But it was discovered that in 1953, Kubrick directed a documentary for the Seafarers International Union called The Seafarers, that seems to be Kubrick's first color film. But experts still believe that he made more documentaries that are yet to be found. After a few short documentaries, Kubrick thought that he had enough experience to make his feature film debut, Fear and Desire, also known as Shape of Fear. Released in 1952, the film is only 61 minutes long and made with just 15 people, including the 5 lead actors. Even though Kubrick was still trying to find his footing as a director, it still had that distinct Kubrick style. The movie's about a group of soldiers behind enemy lines, but it's more about the individuals and the mental toll war takes on them. Classic Kubrick. The film was funded by the director himself, along with his friends and family, particularly his uncle Martin Perveller, a wealthy pharmacist, who provided much of the film's planned $10,000 budget. Working within these constraints, Kubrick planned Fear and Desire to be a silent film, but eventually decided to add sound, and along with costly mistakes during filming, one of which required a small amount of footage to be flipped in post-production, the cost of Fear and Desire soon ballooned to over $50,000. He was only able to finish the film by being bailed out by producer Richard de Rockman in exchange for helping him with an educational program about Abraham Lincoln. The finished product was met with decent reviews, but it was not a commercial success, forcing Kubrick to take some less than desirable jobs, like the previously mentioned documentary The Seafarers, to fund his next film. And proving that Kubrick was born a legend, he didn't like how Fear and Desire turned out and destroyed the original negatives and any copies he could find. I mean, right out of the gate, he had one feature film in the tank, and dude was already making lost media at a 1-to-1 ratio. Kubrick's actions were compounded by the film's production company going out of business later that year when the owner died, resulting in the film disappearing completely just a few years after its release. And for over 40 years, Stanley Kubrick's first film was lost to the public. But luckily, the film managed to survive in private collections and finally emerged when it was given a screening at the 1993 Telluride Film Festival. Even though by this point the movie's copyright had lapsed and was public domain, Kubrick discouraged screenings, issuing a statement calling Fear and Desire a bumbling amateur film exercise. But no one listened, and the film could still be seen at various film festivals over the years. Even still, Fear and Desire wasn't given an official release until December 14th, 2011, when it aired on Turner Classic Movies, and was finally released on home media in 2012. The Burning Secret. He would follow up Fear and Desire with Killer's Kiss in 1955 and The Killing in 1956, both again partially funded with the help of friends and family, and debuted to mediocre sales. But critics liked The Killing, and so did the head of production at MGM, Dor Shari, who wanted to help Kubrick make his next film. The two threw around some ideas. Kubrick had suggested Paths of Glory, but Cherie doubted that it would be successful enough to turn a profit. Around this time, Kubrick found Stefan Zweig's 1913 novella, Burning Secret, about a man who befriends a 10-year-old boy in order to seduce his mom. Kubrick, along with Calder Willingham, a frequent collaborator in Kubrick's early years, wrote a screenplay together based on Zweig's story. But in 1956, it was again rejected, mainly because it would be difficult to accurately adapt the novel under the then censorship guidelines of the Hays Code. This rejected screenplay would be virtually unknown even among die-hard Kubrick fans, and assumed to have vanished, perhaps still being held by MGM. But against all odds, in 2018, over 60 years after it was written, Nathan Abrams, a film professor and Kubrick expert, discovered the long-lost screenplay. He said, "I couldn't believe it. It's so exciting. It was believed to have been lost. Kubrick aficionados knew he wanted to do it, but no one ever thought it was completed." The script is dated 24 October 1959, being completed just a few months after The Killing was released. But now that we have the script, it is possible that this film could someday be made. Spartacus. Around the time The Burning Secret was written, a major shakeup occurred at MGM. Dor Cherie, among others, were fired. And without someone in his corner at MGM, Kubrick moved to United Artists, who greenlit the script for his breakthrough film, Paths of Glory. And based on my research, there are no recorded instances of deleted scenes from this project. After the success of Paths of Glory, Kubrick was in high demand, and in 1960 released his first big-budget production, Spartacus. And Spartacus holds a unique position in Kubrick's filmography as the only film the director ever made where he did not have total creative control. He wasn't even the original director, replacing Anthony Mann only a week after shooting had begun. And even though he didn't have total control, cinematographer Russell Meddy complained about how precise and demanding Kubrick was. As you'll see through this video, Kubrick has some brutal one-liners. When Meddy threatened to quit, Kubrick said, "You can do your job by sitting in your chair and shutting up. I'll be the director of photography." Meddy did just that. He continued to do his job, but protested the whole time and continued to badmouth the director and the movie afterwards. And he expressed his disdain up until the 33rd Academy Awards, where Spartacus earned him an Oscar for Best Cinematography, the only major award of Russell Meddy's career. Even though this was Kubrick's first film to win an Academy Award, 4 in total, and was winner of Best Picture at the Golden Globes, Kubrick would later disown Spartacus, and remains the only film Kubrick ever worked on to have all of its deleted scenes restored. Kubrick didn't feel a personal attachment to Spartacus, so in the 90s, Kubrick gave his blessing to have the deleted scenes restored and collaborated on the project over the phone. A team of 30 restored the film's battle scenes that were cut for being too graphic, and an infamous scene that was demanded be removed by the National Legion of Decency. This 4-minute scene had General Crassus attempting to seduce Antonius in a bathhouse. And man had no riz. He was using analogies like eating oysters and eating snails. Even with Kubrick involved in the studio's restoration process, the original audio from this bathhouse scene couldn't be recovered and had to be dubbed over. The actor who played Antonius, Tony Curtis, was able to return to dub his lost dialogue, but General Crassus, played by Laurence Olivier, had died 2 years prior. His lost dialogue was dubbed over by his protege, Anthony Hopkins, at the request of Olivier's widow. The restoration debuted in 1991. During the making of Spartacus, Stanley Kubrick and actor Marlon Brando collaborated on an adaptation of the novel The Authentic Death of Henry Jones, a movie that would become One-Eyed Jacks. The script was first written by Rod Serling, the narrator of The Twilight Zone, but this original version was rejected and passed through numerous hands until Guy Trosper came in to make the finishing touches. Stanley was set to direct this film. Contracts were signed, and One-Eyed Jacks was concluding pre-production and just about to start filming. But for undisclosed reasons, Kubrick left the movie just 2 weeks before principal photography. If I had to guess why, it's probably because both Kubrick and Marlon Brando are some of the most notoriously difficult people to work with in Hollywood. When I was researching this, I was shocked that the movie got this far. Brando ended up directing, and it was okay. It was reported at the time that Kubrick was paid $100,000 to not direct the movie over creative differences. But Kubrick would later say he left because, quote, "It just had become obvious to me that Brando wanted to direct the movie." It's not known how much Kubrick contributed to One-Eyed Jacks, and it seems like Stanley was under contract not to speak about the movie and received no credits. So we'll probably never really know, but knowing what we know about Stanley Kubrick and that it nearly made it to filming with him as director, he likely played a huge role in the final product.
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Dr. Strangelove, the lost pie fight scene. Kubrick would release his official follow-up to Spartacus with 1962's Lolita, and in probably the most shocking twist of this entire video, there are no scenes that Stanley was forced to cut from this movie, though he did later say that he never would have made the movie in the first place if he knew how careful he had to consider the censorship boards while filming it. It was given an X rating in England, and 10 seconds were trimmed out from the US release. So far, Kubrick has 6 films under his belt in just 10 years. 2 of them, Paths of Glory and Spartacus, will go on to be preserved in the National Film Registry. Over the next 35 years, he would only make 7 more films, all of which truly deserve consideration among the greatest films ever made. In the process of making these 7 landmark films, Kubrick would amass one of the largest collections of lost media of any director since the silent era, and none of it was by accident. Like I said before, Kubrick was so protective of his movies that he would burn all outtakes, alternate scenes, and deleted scenes, so that no one could ever add them back in against his will. Of Kubrick's vast amount of lost, deleted scenes, one of his largest and most important single scene comes from Dr. Strangelove. 1964's Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, is a satirical comedy about a rogue US Air Force general who orders a nuclear strike on the Soviet Union and the US officials trying to stop the attack. The movie famously ends with the titular Dr. Strangelove miraculously standing from his wheelchair, announcing he has a plan, but before he can elaborate, the film abruptly cuts to a montage of nuclear bombs detonating to the song We'll Meet Again. The ending works incredibly well, but at the same time is jarring, and left audiences feeling like they were missing something. And it turns out they were right, but it probably wasn't what they expected. The film originally ended with a large-scale pie fight. This original ending would have had General Turgidson notice the Russian ambassador taking pictures with a spy camera and tackling him. While trying to search the ambassador for more cameras, the ambassador throws a custard pie at him, but just before it hits him, the general ducks and the pie ends up hitting the president, prompting a mass pie fight to break out, mimicking a war setup. During the scuffle, Strangelove falls out of his wheelchair and his evil hand pulls out a gun. The two halves struggle over the weapon, firing it in the air. This stops the pie fight. He calls everyone to order, but the president and the Russian ambassador have lost their minds and are making sandcastles out of the pie. Turgidson announces Dr. Strangelove as the new leader. Everyone cheers. But while filming, the actors were laughing and smiling during the whole thing, and it didn't come off as serious as Kubrick intended. He would later say, "I decided it was a farce and not consistent with the satirical tone of the rest of the film." Later in his life, he would call the scene a disaster of Homeric proportions. Film critic Alexander Walker saw the scene and said, "The cream pies were flying around so thickly, people lost definition, and you couldn't really say whom we were looking at." But the reason for this scene not making the final cut might go a little bit deeper than an inconsistent tone or lack of picture quality. Dr. Strangelove's first screening was scheduled for November 22nd, 1963, the day JFK was assassinated. A strange day to choose, but who am I to tell Kubrick what to do? During the deleted pie scene, when President Muffley takes a pie to the face, General Turgidson says, "Gentlemen, our gallant young president has been struck down in his prime." Though it's disputed that this was the reason, the movie's release was delayed to January 1964. And because of the assassination, we do know that one line was changed from the final cut. In the final version, the character Slim Pickens says,
"Fella could have a pretty good weekend in Vegas with all that stuff."
They changed Dallas to Vegas since JFK was shot in Dallas. But the original line can still be heard in the French sub of the movie. Kubrick insisted that the pie scene was cut before JFK's assassination. The film's editor, Anthony Harvey, said the footage was placed in a bin with other scraps and was misplaced or lost. And as of now, only a few behind-the-scenes stills have been found. 2001: A Space Odyssey. Deleted scenes. One of the most interesting things about Stanley Kubrick is that he can make films over such a wide range of genres, all while managing to bring his signature style to all of them. So after making a couple of war movies, a historical epic, some film noirs, a psychological drama, and a comedy, he followed them all up with one of the most groundbreaking, thought-provoking sci-fi epics of all time. Inspired by the short story The Sentinel by Arthur C. Clarke, Kubrick's 1968 film 2001: A Space Odyssey follows significant technical developments that coincide with the presence of an alien monolith, spanning millions of years from the first use of tools to space travel and the emergence of a new being, all told with minimal dialogue in 143 minutes. But when the film debuted in early April 1968, there are 4 theaters that witnessed the original 160-minute cut. But following these screenings, Kubrick and editor Ray Lovejoy cut 17 minutes from the movie to streamline the narrative, and even added a brief low-angle shot of the monolith early on in the film. Some of these deleted scenes fill out sections that were just implied in the final film. A scene of Dave Bowman searching for replacement antenna parts in storage, a scene showing Hal severing radio communications between the Discovery and Poole's pod before killing him, and other scenes were just trimmed down, like segments from The Dawn of Man, some additional shots of Frank Poole jogging, and additional shots of Poole's spacewalk before he was offed. Just like almost all of Kubrick's deleted scenes, he and his assistants burned everything, and for decades they were presumed lost forever. But in a shocking discovery, in December 2010, it was announced that Warner Brothers had unearthed the 17 minutes of lost footage uncovered in a Kansas salt mine. Included in this announcement was an additional still of a previously unknown deleted scene of Dave playing piano. And despite one of the greatest discoveries in lost media and film preservation, Kubrick's estate has stated that they will likely not release the footage, leaving the deleted scenes from 2001: A Space Odyssey possibly lost to the public forever. The greatest film never made. After finishing 2001: A Space Odyssey, Kubrick began pre-production on his next film, which has been dubbed the greatest film never made, Stanley Kubrick's Napoleon. For 2 years, Kubrick researched Napoleon and his inner circle, but I don't think researched is the right word. What Kubrick did for the next 2 years of his life is nothing short of obsession. He and his assistants collected a staggering 15,000 location photos, 17,000 slides of Napoleon imagery, 100 photos of potential costumes, made casting choices, and compiled a detailed outline of production considerations, including specifics like who he wanted as costume designer, his desire to film by candlelight, what kind of camera he would need to achieve that effect, even down to a cost breakdown of the battle scenes, and ways to cut costs like using paper costumes for extras in the distance. He somehow even convinced the Romanian People's Army to lend soldiers in order to film large battle scenes on location. But most impressive of all is his famous Napoleon cabinet. In this cabinet were thousands of meticulously detailed index cards detailing exactly what Napoleon and those closest to him were doing at any given day to ensure the movie was historically accurate. For the titular role, Kubrick had considered a few actors: David Hemmings, Oscar Werner, Ian Holmes, and Jack Nicholson. For the role of Josephine Bonaparte, he considered Audrey Hepburn, but she turned the role down. With research complete, he wrote a preliminary script that, along with all of his pre-production materials, have been preserved and are mostly available to the public. Going through the script myself, there are quite a few oddities. There's a surprising amount of sex in the screenplay, and it made use of 2 narrators, a traditional narrator and Napoleon's inner monologue. Usually this would be a massive red flag, indicating an inferior screenplay, but if anyone could pull this off, it'd be Kubrick. Aside from these quirks, the screenplay is an epic character study, showing the rise and fall of a powerful man who was always doomed to fail by his own personal flaws. Kubrick said he expected to create the best movie ever made, but in the end, MGM backed out and retained the rights to a Kubrick-helmed Napoleon epic. There have been a few reasons given over the years as to why MGM got cold feet, but the main reason seems to be that the studio did not believe a Napoleon-centric film could be a financial success after the failure of 1970's Waterloo. Kubrick went back to his Napoleon film from time to time, but it never materialized. Since a treasure trove of Kubrick's research on this unmade film have been preserved, a few attempts have been made to bring Kubrick's Napoleon to life. In 2013, Steven Spielberg announced a miniseries based on Kubrick's script, and in 2016, HBO announced their own miniseries. But the only one that ever got off the ground was a 2018 stage adaptation of Kubrick's Napoleon. And just on the horizon is Ridley Scott's own adaptation of Napoleon, starring Joaquin Phoenix, though this doesn't seem to be based on Kubrick's version, coming out in November 2023. Much of Kubrick's research that went into Napoleon would later be used for his 1975 movie Barry Lyndon, set 15 years prior to the Napoleonic Wars.
The Durango 95 toured away real horror show. A nice, warm, vibrating feeling all through your gutty woods.
A Clockwork Orange. As you might be able to tell from his work on Napoleon, Stanley was known as an obsessive director, demanding absolute perfection to the point where simple scenes were shot dozens of times. Because of this, many of his later films spent years or even decades in development. But his 1971 masterpiece, A Clockwork Orange, just might be the last film he ever made with any sense of efficiency. And likely because of this, it only has a few deleted scenes. As far as we know, there are only 3 deleted scenes. The gang attacking a professor as he's leaving the library, the Droogs stealing the Durango 95, and most notably, a small scene where the Droogs use a few old ladies as an alibi when they plan to rob the cat lady. Currently, there is no evidence that any of these scenes survived Kubrick's destruction. Barry Lyndon. Just like A Clockwork Orange, Barry Lyndon has very few deleted scenes that we know of. The film follows the rise and fall of the titular Barry Lyndon, an Anglo-Irishman who marries an aristocratic widow to gain money and power. Like I said before, Kubrick took advantage of the ungodly amount of research he did on Napoleon and applied it to Barry Lyndon. And I believe this level of planning contributed to why there is a lack of extraneous material. Also, the film is incredibly long, so I'm assuming he just didn't cut anything. Barry Lyndon was originally planned to be filmed mostly on location in Ireland, but production was halted because Kubrick was threatened by the IRA. For those who need a history recap, Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, and the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, is a series of Irish paramilitary groups that fight to unify Ireland, occasionally resorting to violence. Kubrick received a phone call telling him he was on an IRA hit list and had 24 hours to leave the country. He left right away. His brother-in-law, Jan Harland, said, whether the threat was a hoax or it was real, almost doesn't matter. Stanley was not willing to take the risk. He was threatened and packed his bag and went home. At this time, about 1/3 of the movie had been filmed, and for a while it was rumored that the movie was cancelled, since Kubrick did not want to return to Ireland for a while. But he eventually resumed filming in England and West Germany. And like I mentioned before, Barry Lyndon is very long, clocking in at 185 minutes, making it his second longest film behind Spartacus. I really have no concrete evidence to support this, but a 3-hour movie probably didn't have a lot of extra material lying around. In my research, I could only find one deleted scene with any evidence, a sex scene between Barry and Lady Lyndon, that we do have an image of. There are 2 other scenes that are rumored to have been deleted, but I couldn't find reliable sources for them. But Barry Lyndon, I believe, is Kubrick's most underanalyzed film, and definitely his most underrated. So I wouldn't be surprised if there are more deleted scenes that were either too obscure for me to find out about, or that could be proven with a little more research into the film. The Shining. While I do believe that 2001: A Space Odyssey is the single most studied and analyzed film in history, I would argue that his 1980 psychological horror film, based on the 1977 novel by Stephen King, The Shining, is even more difficult to understand. When you watch 2001: A Space Odyssey for the first time, you have 100 questions. The movie is begging to be studied. But on first viewing of The Shining, there really doesn't seem to be too much there. The Torrance family serves as caretakers of the Overlook Hotel during the off-season. The hotel is haunted, creepy things happen, the father is eventually driven insane, and the hotel consumes him. At least this is how I felt after watching it, and I'm sure others had that feeling too. It was a nice horror film with some mainstream appeal. But the longer the movie sits with you, nothing seems to add up. And one question just begets another. What exactly is The Shining, and how is it relevant to the story? What's with the whole bear costume scene? Why did Kubrick change so much from the book? Why are there so many continuity errors? Are they intentional? Did they mean to change the lighting between shots? What's the symbolism of the hedge maze? It's not in the book. Why are there so many references to Native Americans? Are there 2 Grady's? Why doesn't the building's layout make spatial sense? Oh my god, Kubrick faked the moon landing and hid his face in the clouds. But seriously, some of these interpretations do hold some validity, but others are absolute lunacy. I'll leave it up to the comment section to decide which. There could have been even more for fans to pore over if Kubrick had kept the deleted scenes. A series of notable cut scenes include the infamous scrapbook that can actually be seen briefly in the finished film. Its first appearance was meant to take place right after Jack was throwing the tennis ball at the wall and looking at the hedge maze. In the deleted scene, Jack finds a trail of writing materials, following them to the Colorado Lounge, where he finds a mysterious scrapbook about the, quote, bloody history of the Overlook Hotel. Another scrapbook scene would soon follow the first, just after the Tuesday title card. Wendy, having just gotten out of the maze with Danny, finds Jack looking at the scrapbook in the Colorado Lounge. He tells her that the book is Big Money as inspiration for his new book. He flips through the book and finds pictures of Grady standing outside the room they're currently in. The scene closes with Jack announcing the title of his book, Tales of the Winter Caretaker by Jack Torrance. A winter caretaker. Oh, it really just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? The scene was meant to signal the beginning of Jack's obsession with the hotel. The scene was taken directly from the novel it's based on, and co-writer Diane Johnson fought to keep it in, but Kubrick only included the scrapbook as an unexplained prop in the final film. And a line that's still in the movie was meant to relate back to the book. While Jack's talking to Delbert Grady, he says, "I saw your picture in the newspaper." The scrapbook prop itself was preserved and can be viewed at the Stanley Kubrick Archives in London. These scrapbook scenes were fairly meaningful in explaining more clearly Jack's descent into madness, but there were some minor scenes that were cut too. A snowball fight between Jack and Danny where Wendy gets upset for Jack throwing the snowballs too hard. Kubrick reportedly made Shelley Duvall re-record her dialogue after filming had wrapped while she was in the middle of filming the Popeye movie, causing production on that movie to stall, and then they ended up not even using the scene in the final film. Damn, Kubrick really tortured this lady. A scene of Jack walking down the hotel hallways after being jump scared by the old woman and peering over the balcony of the Colorado room. Another scene of Jack hearing voices in the ballroom where a ghost throws a ball back at him. There was an alternate version of Halloran's death that was more visceral. Another right after Jack finishes talking to Lloyd the bartender in the gold room. He would get another jump scare and sees all the guests are dead through the bar table mirror. Some of the bodies were covered in blood, some had knives in their backs or chests, and the skeletons they used ended up being reused near the end of the film when Wendy sees all the apparitions in the lobby. And speaking of the part where Wendy sees the apparitions through the hotel, there were additional clips that were filmed. A really notable one was Wendy seeing Miss Grady's body through a mirror, and when Wendy screams in fear, the mirror would shatter. Shelley Duvall would later comment on this scene, saying it was a really scary scene, but I don't think the audience would have understood who she was. And the prop head used for Miss Grady can be seen in the documentary, The Making of The Shining. A lot of these scenes just added extra context to the film's narrative, but didn't overall change the film in any meaningful way. But this final deleted scene from The Shining, in my opinion, would have ruined the movie. The Lost Epilogue. The Lost Epilogue is the most famous deleted scene from the film because it was actually shown in early screenings of The Shining, being cut so late into production that the actors that only appear in this deleted scene are still included in the film's credits. After Jack is seen frozen in the hedge maze, the film fades to daytime. The police arrive, but upon investigation of the maze, are unable to find Jack's body. Cut to a nearby hospital, where the Overlook hotel manager, Stuart Ullman, is coming to visit Danny and Wendy. He finds Danny playing Chutes and Ladders with a nurse at the reception desk. Ullman then enters Wendy's hospital room, where he informs her that the police could not find Jack's body or any evidence of a supernatural occurrence. He believes Wendy hallucinated the strange happenings, and concludes by inviting Danny and her to stay with him in LA. As Ullman leaves the hotel, he says to Danny, "Almost forgot something," and tosses him Jack's tennis ball. The movie then fades to the classic slow zoom on the photo of the Overlook Hotel that was included in the final film. This scene was shown at early screenings in LA and New York. Kubrick was in the audience and observed the crowd. When the epilogue was shown, the audience would walk out right after the credits. But when the scene was excluded, the audience would applaud and sit through the credits discussing the movie. Kubrick wanted to include the scene because he wanted the audience to know that Wendy and Danny were safe. But given the audience's reaction, he called Warner Brothers and had their editor cut the scene. Critic Roger Ebert saw one of these early screenings with the epilogue included, and in 2006 he said, "Kubrick was wise to remove the epilogue. It pulled one rug too many from under the story. It's believed that all copies were removed and destroyed. All we have are some continuity Polaroids and the 35mm film ends that are held at the Stanley Kubrick archive." But to end things on a more optimistic note, there is one single deleted scene from The Shining that we know exists. A scene of Wendy carrying Danny down the halls of the hotel after her argument with Jack. This scene was found in an auction for work prints belonging to Emilio Di Alessandro, one of Kubrick's assistants. Who won this auction is unknown, and they have never come forward with the footage. But we at least know it exists. And others still hold hope that there may be more copies that were forgotten or missed when being culled. One of these believers is director Lee Unkrich, who in March 2023 released his book, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, a massive compendium of the film, including new angles of the deleted hospital scene. The book also includes an amazing anecdote, where Kubrick finishes filming a scene, and he turns to the crew, winks, and said, "Let the French film critics figure that one out." Man, this is just classic Kubrick. The book looks great, but I might have to wait for it to go on sale.
You're so ugly you could be a modern art masterpiece.
Full Metal Jacket. Full Metal Jacket is Stanley Kubrick's 1987 Vietnam War film about a group of Marines in boot camp and their experience in the war after graduating. Full Metal Jacket's deleted scenes are unique among Kubrick's films. For each deleted scene, we have almost no documentation. All of the accounts of the film having any deleted scenes come from interviews with the actors, some taking place decades after the film's release. The earliest discussion of a deleted scene comes from a 1990 interview with Bomb magazine, where actor Tony Spartacus talks about his big scene being cut. Spartacus was set to play Captain January, who only had a few minutes of screen time, but in these few minutes, he had a huge 5-page monologue that ended up being cut from the film. For some context, the book that Full Metal Jacket is based on, The Short Timers, has 3 sections, the middle of which Kubrick cut out for his adaptation, giving the film a distinct 2-part structure. And within this removed middle section was Captain January's monologue. In this deleted scene, Captain January and Private Payback were playing Monopoly with real money, while Joker looks on. Joker, who is a sergeant for the newspaper Stars and Stripes, asks about a news story that was suppressed by the higher-ups concerning the use of beehive rounds against the Vietnamese, which is a violation of the Geneva Convention, expressing his disdain for the truth being kept from the public. Captain January then goes on a rant about their role in the war. Their job is to make the US forces look good. This conversation is meant to sow the seeds of disenfranchisement within Joker, something that I do think Kubrick manages to do without this scene. Spartacus said this would have been the second largest speaking role in the movie, and before the movie came out, he was being called for interviews. But around this time, Stanley told him there was about a 50-50 chance that this part would be cut. Since this first-hand account was made only a few years after the movie came out, and Kubrick himself never disputed it as far as I can tell, I do believe this scene was cut from the movie. And the version of the script that's available to the public does include a speaking scene with Captain January, not in the film, but it is not 5 pages long. The most commonly attributed reason for the scene being cut is that another actor in the scene messed up the timing, and Kubrick didn't like it. Thus, Spartacus' character was completely removed. In 2017, Joker actor Matthew Modine told Yahoo Movies about another deleted scene. He said that halfway through filming, he made an offhand comment to Kubrick that the only thing missing from the movie was a sex scene. Modine didn't think much of their conversation, but a few days later, Kubrick came back with new pages that included Modine's requested scene. The scene would have followed actress Papian Susu's immortal words, after which she would take Joker back to her house. Stanley said, "You'll be in bed with her and she'll say she wants more boom boom, and you'll say something from an old movie." Modine's wife suggested a line from the 1942 movie Now Voyager. He and Kubrick agreed. Modine continued, "I lit 2 cigarettes just like Paul Henry and said, 'We have the moon, let's not ask for the stars.' I reversed it because we had landed on the moon. It was filmed in one flowing, elegant camera move. That's the one scene I wish was in the movie." Man, could you imagine if the moon landing was referenced in a Kubrick movie after The Shining? Man, the conspiracy theories would be nuts. Other than these scenes, there are a few more that have little to no evidence that are commonly thrown around as pieces of trivia, but I've had a hard time tracking down reliable sources. Like a scene where Hartman breaks character as the stern drill sergeant and tells the recruits he's proud of them after they've graduated. But the most famous is a scene where a group of Marines are playing soccer with a human head. This rumor does seem to have a bit of truth to it, as there was a prop made for the Vietnamese child sniper at the end of the film that was going to be used in a scene where the Marines are throwing the head around. But for every crew member that says this scene was filmed, there are just as many that say it was planned but never filmed. So I really don't know who to believe. And there's one more interesting piece of lost media surrounding Full Metal Jacket that I would be remiss not to bring up here. R. Lee Emery's portrayal of Gunnery Sergeant Hartman is one of the most iconic performances in any Kubrick film, but he wasn't originally given the role. He was brought on as a technical advisor because of his military experience. Ermey had asked to audition for the role, but Kubrick said he wasn't vicious enough, based on seeing him play Staff Sergeant Loyce in The Boys in Company C. Tim Colseri was brought on to play Hartman. But Ermey not only had real-life experience in the Marines, but was actually a drill sergeant during Vietnam. For his role as technical advisor, Ermey made video recordings demonstrating how to play a drill sergeant. He improvised the lines against a group of Royal Marines who were being considered as background characters for the movie. When Tim Colseri played the role, he could only do it for about 30 minutes at a time before needing a break. But based on these recordings, Ermey could go for hours. When Kubrick watched the tapes, he realized Ermey was perfect for the role, and in the end, about 50% of Hartman's dialogue was completely improvised by Ermey, some of it based on these lost tapes. The funniest part is that landing this role was all part of Ermey's galaxy brain plan. In interviews, Ermey said his long-term goal was to break into Hollywood as a technical advisor and leverage his experience into landing him a role in movies, something he did in Full Metal Jacket, Apocalypse Now, and The Boys in Company C. And the tape that landed R. Lee Ermey the role of a lifetime has never been released to the public. It may be part of the Stanley Kubrick archive, but this remains unconfirmed. But it's more likely that these tapes were burnt prior to Stanley's death in 1999. No footage or stills have ever been recovered. The Aryan Papers and AI, artificial intelligence. In the decade plus following Full Metal Jacket, Stanley Kubrick would only make one more film. And had he lived to make more, there are two films that likely would have been his next project: The Aryan Papers and AI, Artificial Intelligence, both of which Kubrick poured hundreds of hours into before working on his final film. He had long wanted to make a movie about the atrocities committed by the Nazis and eventually decided on an adaptation of the novel Wartime Lies, about a Jewish boy and his family trying to survive in Nazi Poland. And in the 90s, the movie almost made its way to filming. In typical Kubrick fashion, he and his assistants did a huge amount of research, reading every book on the topic they could find and convincing the Danish Film Institute to provide him with documentary footage of the era. Just like with Napoleon, he even convinced governments to assist in the film, getting permission to close the city center of Brno for a weekend. But the Aryan Papers surpassed Napoleon, moving to the screen test phase, casting Joseph Mazzello as the lead, the little boy from Jurassic Park, who was flown out to meet Stanley. He had also considered Uma Thurman or Julia Roberts for the co-lead, but went with Johanna ter Steeg for the boy's aunt, who also met up with Kubrick for a screen test. He chose to abandon the movie in 1993 when Spielberg released Schindler's List. A couple other reasons given were that his middle daughter got pregnant. Kubrick's wife insisted that she stay with the daughter during pregnancy, and I guess Kubrick never went anywhere without his wife, which is pretty cute. And later, his wife would say that the subject matter was too depressing. Instead, Kubrick moved on to his final film, Eyes Wide Shut. During the time he worked on Aryan Papers, there was overlap with his other unmade film, AI, Artificial Intelligence. And this one wasn't quite so unmade. Another of Kubrick's long gestating projects that he never finished was an adaptation of the 1969 short story, Super Toys Last All Summer Long, by Brian Aldiss. In the 70s, Brian Aldiss himself hired Kubrick to write a film treatment based on this story, and as always, Kubrick was methodical and slow-moving. Over the next decade plus, Kubrick went through numerous co-writers, giving each a copy of The Adventure of Pinocchio as inspiration, calling his idea for AI a picturesque robot version of Pinocchio. Some even said that during pre-production, he referred to the movie as Pinocchio, not AI. The first writer brought on was Bob Shaw, who only lasted 6 weeks. The project was initially considered a collaboration between Kubrick and Brian Aldiss, but in 1989, Kubrick somehow gained so much control over the project that he fired the book's author from the adaptation of his own book. After being fired, Aldiss said, "Not only did the bastard fire me, he hired my enemy instead." The enemy in question being sci-fi writer Ian Watson, who eventually was fired as well. In 1992, Kubrick brought on 2001: A Space Odyssey co-writer and the original author of the book it was based on, Arthur C. Clarke. And you guessed it, man was fired too. In an interview with the New York Times, he said his version of the script was rejected instantly. He hated it and asked me to tear it up. While Kubrick was trying to nail down a script, at the same time he was trying to convince Steven Spielberg to take over the film as director, and Kubrick himself serving as producer for this film. But Spielberg declined and convinced Kubrick to stay on as director. By May 1991, AI was written, but put aside to work on the Aryan Papers. Kubrick believed that no child actor could accurately portray the lead character, David, expecting to rely almost solely on CGI and animatronics. And he knew technology at the time wasn't yet sophisticated enough to pull it off. But after seeing Jurassic Park in '93, he thought the tech was there and announced that AI would start production the following year. Jurassic Park VFX supervisor Dennis Muren and Neil Gorman were brought on, who, along with Industrial Light and Magic, developed a previs for Kubrick. Kubrick hated it. He was not happy with the work or the cost, but production continued anyways. In another attempt to bring David to life, Chris Cunningham was brought on to make an animatronic for the character. We tried to construct a little boy with a movable rubber face to see whether we could make it look appealing, but it was a total failure. It looked awful. Aside from considering CGI or animatronics for the lead, he also considered Joseph Mazzello, who he had also tested for the lead in the Aryan Papers. But AI was put on hold when Eyes Wide Shut was starting to come together, and as we know, he passed away during post-production and never got to make AI or the Aryan Papers. Following Kubrick's passing, Jan Harlan and Christiane Kubrick once again asked Steven Spielberg to take over as director. He finally obliged. Spielberg would construct the film using Kubrick's extensive notes and the 90-page film treatment written by Ian Watson. And instead of bringing on another writer to finish it, Spielberg decided to finish writing the film himself. AI, Artificial Intelligence, debuted in 2001 to mixed reviews. The standout being, of course, Haley Joel Osment's performance that pulled off a more than convincing performance of the lead that Kubrick had thought impossible to be played by a child actor. But critics said the film felt like a strange combination of Kubrick's cold, methodical style and Spielberg's warm, cozy style. Producer Bonnie Curtis said, "He tried to direct a Kubrick film. I would jokingly call him Steve Lee Kubrick during it because the material itself is just a crash between the two of them. I mean, it's a twisted Spielberg movie or a loving Kubrick film." Writer on the film, Ian Watson, said the movie was fairly faithful to Kubrick's vision, even the ending that's often believed to have been changed by Spielberg. Despite what anyone says about the film, it is a fantastic tribute to the late director, full of homages to Kubrick's work, and in my opinion, is the single greatest example of an artist's work being fully realized after their passing. Before we get to our final entry, here are just a few honorable mentions. There are so many more Kubrick projects I could talk about, but here are just some of my favorites. In 1988, Kubrick bought the film rights to the radio serial drama Shadow on the Sun, about a meteor containing an alien virus crashing to Earth. The script was written just before he moved on to AI. In the 1950s, Kubrick wrote a treatment for the film Lunatic at Large in collaboration with Jim Thompson. The script was discovered following Kubrick's passing by his son-in-law, Philip Hobbs, who's been working to make this film a reality since 2006. It's been reported that filming began in 2021, but there's been no news since. And I have to mention this one. The time the Beatles approached Stanley Kubrick to direct an adaptation of Lord of the Rings starring the band members in the lead roles. Kubrick obviously said no, and it might just be the single goofiest movie idea ever conceived. Eyes Wide Shut, The Missing 24 Minutes. Stanley Kubrick's life and works are surrounded in mystery and conspiracy. The most well-known Kubrick conspiracies are his involvement in faking the moon landing and that he left coded messages in The Shining, hinting at his part in the conspiracy. But the next most prominent theory is that the famed director was murdered for exposing a secret society in his final film, Eyes Wide Shut. And to cover it up, parts of the movie were removed after his passing. Kubrick had been working on an adaptation of the 1926 book Trum Novelle, also known as Dream Story, for about 30 years before it would eventually become Eyes Wide Shut. Through various stages of development, actors like Woody Allen and Steve Martin were considered for the lead, in a version with a more comedic edge. But the final product ended up being surprisingly faithful to the book. Both the film and the book are about a wife who confesses to her husband about fantasizing over another man, resulting in the husband embarking on a night of temptation that involves a masked party of wealthy elites, ladies of the night, and other seductions that he narrowly avoids. The director spent a record-breaking 400 consecutive days filming the movie, and on March 1st, 1990, screened the film for Warner Brothers executives Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman. This version of the film was mostly finished, just needing some post-production work like a finalized score, audio mixing, and color correction. But just days later, on March 7th, Kubrick passed away of a heart attack at age 70. The movie was completed without him, and Eyes Wide Shut premiered on July 13th, 1999. Executives claimed that the cut they saw on March 1st was the final version intended by the director, but Kubrick was known to change movies up to their premiere and even after initial screenings, as we've seen with both 2001: A Space Odyssey and The Shining. And ever since, there have been debates on how complete Eyes Wide Shut really is. Given the subject matter of the film, Kubrick's passing just days after its first private screening, and the possibility of studio interference, suspicions were raised, leading some to the conclusion that Kubrick showed too much. He knew too much. He had to be taken out and his movie altered. 24 minutes removed from Eyes Wide Shut that exposed the wealthiest and most powerful members of society. Some even believe in this footage he confessed to faking the moon landing. For evidence, fans have pointed to the use of CGI to cover up nudity in order to ensure the film had an R rating, an effect not too dissimilar from Austin Powers. So if Warner Bros. Was willing to make these changes after Kubrick's passing, what else would they change? Eventually, the number that seemed to be agreed upon was 24 minutes that were cut from the film. It's difficult to pinpoint where this number comes from, but signs point to an elusive interview with actress Julian Davis, who played Mandy in the film, where she claims that scenes were cut for exposing the rich. Some even cite interviews with Kubrick's children where they confess the same, but none have ever provided a reliable source for these claims. A few of Kubrick's collaborators chimed in on the subject, some agreeing that this is Kubrick's completed film, while some others disagreed. In particular, R. Lee Ermey, who claims to have talked to Kubrick over the phone a week before his passing. He told me it was a piece of and he was disgusted with it, and that the critics were going to have him for lunch. Cruise and Kidman had their way with him, exactly the words he used. Kubrick's daughter, Katharina Kubrick, have denied Ermey's claims. The only deleted scene with any evidence comes from a still obtained from the Kubrick archives, showing Cruise and Kidman's characters in a boat with their daughter. It's speculated that this scene was either an homage to his film Barry Lyndon, or it wasn't a scene at all, but staged as part of a collection of family photos to be used as set dressing. So, as far as the conspiracy theory goes, I do have a few issues. First, I don't find anything suspicious about Kubrick's passing. He was a 70-year-old man who just spent a record-breaking 400 consecutive days filming a movie. A heart attack is not surprising given the circumstances. Second, a common misconception is that Kubrick did not approve of the CGI added to ensure an R rating. He was involved in the process and deemed it a better alternative to cutting the scene entirely. Third, I feel like if Kubrick was going to expose a secret society, he wouldn't make a movie about secret societies. It's almost like saying The Shining is about a haunted house. Like, yes, but no. For me, it all just seems too on the nose for Kubrick. But there are some aspects of the conspiracy theories that I do believe are possible. Mainly that Warner Bros. Tampered with the movie. The idea that they made some changes without Kubrick's consent is not out of the realm of possibility, but I don't believe anything substantial was cut. I'd be more open to the idea of major studio changes if the movie didn't follow the book so precisely, and if the film wasn't so beautifully symmetrical as it is. From my perspective, I think people focus too heavily on the most sensational elements of the film, namely the masked party. We know for a fact that there are powerful people in the world who use their wealth and influence to commit atrocities. I'm not diminishing that in any way, but in the film, the masked party just demonstrates one aspect of human depravity. Throughout the film, we see corruption isn't just isolated to the wealthy, but even to characters as average as the costume shop owner. I think that one of the more difficult messages of the film is that these evils are everywhere, and we all have to do our best to do what we think is right. But I did get this letter in the mail while making this video. I'm sure it was just sent to the wrong address. Thank you so much for watching. What do you think about the possibility of deleted scenes from Eyes Wide Shut? Am I just a shill for the elites paid to cover up the truth? And these lost 24 minutes do exist? Let me know in the comments, and let me know if I missed any of your favorite unmade Kubrick films. Huge shout out to my top tier Patreon supporters, MD the Dude, Can You Say Rote Goat Mafleur, Odesta Honeycrisp, and Miss Dana. Thank you all so much. And apologies for this video taking so long. I took some time off, and then when I started researching this video, I just kept finding more and more Kubrick lost media. The video got very long, very quickly. Thank you all so much for being patient with me. This is Mike with All Things Lost. See you soon.